And I'm going to do the live stream as well. So that will give me just one moment to do that. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So good evening, everybody. My name is Damon Mott-Story. I use they, them, theirs pronouns, and I'm the Healthy Climate Program Director on staff at Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility. And I'm calling in from Northeast Portland, Oregon, the traditional homelands of the Multnomah, bands of Chinook, Kalapuya, Clackamas, and many other tribes that made their homes along the Columbia River. And today we are having our webinar on the health impacts of gas appliances. And we've got a great panel for you, 4 speakers who I'll introduce. We have a couple of different themes on the issue, and then we'll have some chance for questions and answers at the end of the webinar. And if you want to go ahead and jot down questions when you think of them, feel free to make use of the Q&A button on the bottom of the screen. And you can put in your questions into that box, and we'll get to them at the end of the webinar. Alternatively, you can also click the little button that says raise hand, and that'll give us a chance at the end of the webinar for you to ask a live question. Without further ado, I'll just get us kicked off here. And I want to introduce Melanie Plaut, who is a member of Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility. Melanie, I'll let you introduce yourself and some of the intro subject matter that you're going to be digging into. And you are on mute, Melanie. Not sure if you...
Yep.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Melanie Plaut. I'm a volunteer with Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility. I am a retired OBGYN physician, and I've been doing some climate work for about 5 years now. I'm going to start us off by doing, I guess, kind of a quick overview of some of the topics we'll be covering tonight about what natural gas is, how it puts it at risk, and discuss some of the industry greenwashing. And then I'll be turning it over to my colleagues, Ann Turner, Samantha Hernandez, and Theodora Tsongas. So what we're talking about today isn't gasoline. Some people are confused when we use the term gas. We're talking, of course, about this, what comes out of your gas stove, which was cleverly branded over 100 years ago as natural gas. That actually doesn't make any more sense than saying natural coal, but it does mean that people have sort of a warm and fuzzy feeling about natural gas. And what is natural gas? Well, it's about 90% methane. Methane is a very simple molecule, 1 carbon, 4 hydrogens, but it's really carbon dioxide's evil twin in many ways, and in some ways is worse than carbon dioxide for global warming. I might use some different terms here today. I don't like to use the term natural gas, although I sometimes fall into it. But since most of the gas here in Oregon, about 75%, comes from fracking, I might use that term, or I might say fossil gas. My preferred term right now, because it looks like that may be from some recent studies, the best term to use is methane gas. In this presentation, we're going to cover all 5 of these pathways by which frack gas or methane gas affects our health. So indoor pollution, outdoor pollution, explosion risks, pollution at the site of extraction, and of course, the big one, climate change. If you're like me, you may still have natural gas for heating in your furnace and cooking, your gas stove in your home. And really, honestly, until recently, I hadn't given it much thought. But when you burn methane indoors, it produces significant waste products like nitrogen dioxide, carbon monoxide, particulate matter, and formaldehyde. This is going to be a big piece of our subject matter later on when Theodora is going to talk about the evidence that these byproducts are harmful to health. Just briefly, of course, when you burn methane in your house, it also causes significant outdoor pollution. The vents from your furnaces, your water heaters, and your dryers go directly to the outside. In fact, a study from California showed that the nitrogen oxide pollution created by home and commercial buildings far exceeded the amount from gas power plants. So here are the power plants with 12 tons of NOx, and here's the home and commercial buildings with 82 tons of NOx. So this really is a significant source of outdoor pollution. Then explosions. Some of you probably remember this. In 2016, a gas explosion caused by a leaking pipe in an apartment in Northwest Portland injured 8 people and caused $17.2 million in property damage. Across the US, there are about 286 serious natural gas explosions a year. And by serious, it means the type that causes over $50,000 in damage, severe injury, or loss of life. And then, of course, there's climate change. I really probably don't have to tell this audience. Recently, over 200 medical journals simultaneously published an editorial saying that climate change is the single greatest threat to global health. So let's take a step back. Where does natural gas come from? Well, originally it was an unwanted byproduct of traditional oil fields, but now overwhelmingly it comes from fracking. Anne's going to cover in more detail the environmental health and justice issues that are associated with fracking. Because of the fracking boom in the US, natural gas has become exceedingly cheap. And this gas goes to 2 places in our community. First of all, it's piped directly into our homes through a large network of pipes, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. But second, it's used to make electricity. Overall, right now, about 25% of the electricity in Oregon comes from fracked gas. Electricity generation is where the idea that gas is cleaner than coal came from. And it is true that when you burn gas, there's 50% less carbon dioxide created than when you burn coal. But, and this is a big but, due to methane leakage all along the pathway, it causes as much, if not more, global warming than coal. So I think the key word now is to say gas is the new coal, and it is not a bridge to a decarbonized future. So methane is kind of a good news, bad news story. First, the bad, as I've said, pound for pound, methane pollution is 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide over 20 years. And more bad news, methane levels are higher than ever. But there is some good news on the methane front. Methane is potent, but it's relatively short-lived. It stays around for decades, not centuries like carbon dioxide does. A recent UN report notes that methane is responsible for about 1/3 of our global warming. And if we cut human-generated methane by 45% this decade, we actually have the strongest lever to slow climate change over the next 25 years. So that means really by 2030, we need to significantly cut methane. The other good news is that most methane, not all of it, but most of it comes from sources we can control, specifically the extraction and transport of gas and oil. So if methane is so bad, why do we keep using it? As you probably know, the gas industry has been very effective in selling us gas appliances, especially gas stoves. And if your friends are like mine, most of them will say they love their gas stoves. Professional chefs and social media influencers have actually been paid to help us love burning methane indoors and to think that it's a good idea. One of the analogies I heard recently is that we should think of burning methane inside the way we do about lead paint. Originally, everyone thought lead paint was great, made the colors really pretty, but now we know that it's not worth the risk for our health. And the industry has had to change its tune on greenwashing over the years, or on how they're going to describe what they're doing, because really they're in the fight of their lives. First, they tried climate denial, but well, that isn't going to work anymore. And then the message that gas is cleaner than coal, that's been, pretty much disproven. So their last ditch greenwashing is to try to convince us that they can make natural gas clean. Northwest Natural has a pretty sophisticated advertising campaign involving lots of pretty pictures of families or cows in fields with daisies. It's called Less We Can, and it's trying to promote renewable natural gas. Note the double greenwashing there. So what is RNG? Well, any carbon-based product that rots under anaerobic conditions, in other words, without oxygen, creates methane. So think of a landfill, sewage sludge, any kind of agricultural waste, processing wastes, and manure. They can all be rotted, purified, and used as biomethane. So what's wrong with renewable natural gas? Well, first of all, it's still methane, it still leaks, it still has the bad effects if it gets into the atmosphere, it still creates carbon dioxide when you burn it. In fact, it only avoids about half the warming effect of fossil methane. It's not a carbon negative fuel. It's quite expensive. And a study that was done for the Oregon DEQ in 2018 showed that there's only enough to replace about 20% of the fossil gas that's currently used in Oregon. And it can have perverse incentives because if you are going to be taking the biomethane from a factory farm or a landfill, basically you have an incentive, an economic incentive to do more factory farming and more landfills rather than smaller farms or composting. And here's the important part. There isn't a single molecule of RNG in the current Northwest natural gas supply. So this Less We Can promotional campaign is aspirational, and I would say at heart, it's a lie for what's going on right now. Most people believe that the RNG that exists, we ought to save it for certain hard to decarbonize sectors like in marine, aviation, and the steel industry. Another alternative that's been promoted to fossil gas is hydrogen, especially what's called green hydrogen, which would be produced by renewably generated electricity. Hydrogen can also be made directly from our old friend fossil methane. But there are problems with hydrogen. It's very explosive, and you can only mix a small percentage in with natural gas since it corrodes normal pipes. Hydrogen may have a role in the future as a form of energy storage, but like RNG, it's expensive, not available in adequate quantities, and the technology hasn't been worked out. So I just want to emphasize this: biomethane and hydrogen should not be used where we already have existing technologies to electrify, like our homes in our cars. So you can see here that you could have a heat pump dryer, you can have an electric car, a heat pump water heater, heat pump HVAC systems, either ducted or ductless, and induction stoves. All of these things are electric replacements for items that we might be currently running with methane. Experts agree, and popular culture is starting to catch on, that electrification is the cleanest, most economic, and the best solution for decarbonization. If you Google it, you can find a piece that Samantha B. recently did on the dangers of gas stoves. I like the title here, You're Being Gaslit. And if you're a real estate show fan, Jonathan Scott of the Property Brothers has tweeted about how we can all save money and save the planet with more efficient electric appliances. So basically, if you're in a hole, stop digging. We shouldn't be building any new gas plants. And as an aside, I think we're going to get a plug at the end of this for the draft rules for the Climate Protection Program from DEQ. Right now, they would allow gas plants in Oregon to export energy out of state or use it locally, e.g., for example, for Bitcoin mining, would not have to fall under state rules requiring us to clean up our electricity supply. So we don't want any new fossil fuel infrastructure, no new gas plants, no new gas pipes. And what we really need is a ban on gas hookups for new construction. And I would say that one piece of fossil fuel infrastructure are new gas appliances. Because if you put in a new gas stove or a gas furnace or a gas water heater, they will likely stay around for at least 10 to 20 years. So I would propose a three-part strategy for actions we can take. Samantha's going to talk in a minute about immediate things that you can do to decrease your risk from the existing gas appliances in your home. Second of all, don't buy any new gas appliances if you can avoid it. Replace your gas water heaters and furnaces when you can with electric options. And third, advocate for policies which make these things easier for everyone. And I'm going to pass this back to Damon to introduce the other speakers.
Thank you so much, Melanie. So appreciate everything that you just shared with us. And I'm now going to share my screens with slides for our next part of the presentation. So Theodora, if you want to go ahead and put your camera back on, wonderful, we can see you. So Dr. Theodora Tsongas is also a member of Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility, and I'll let her introduce herself and the section that she will be sharing with us on air contaminants and other issues related to that. Take it away, Theodora.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Theodora Tsongas. I'm an environmental health scientist and epidemiologist, and I've been a volunteer with Oregon PSR for about 15 years, so I'm happy to be here tonight. Okay, you can go ahead with the next slide. Okay, gas appliances emit nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, particulate matter, including PM2.5, which is fine particulate matter, and formaldehyde and sulfur dioxide. Gas stoves and ovens pollute indoor air. Gas furnaces, water heaters, and clothes dryers vented outside pollute outdoor air. Next slide. There are no US standards to restrict indoor air pollutants, unfortunately. Gas stoves and ovens emit nitrogen dioxide into indoor air at levels that would be illegal outdoors by US EPA air quality standards. On average, people in the US spend 90% of their time indoors, possibly more for children, the elderly, and those living in low income and poor neighborhoods. Next, please. In children, exposure to nitrogen dioxide results in a 42% increased risk of experiencing asthma symptoms or current asthma, a 24% increased risk of ever being diagnosed with asthma by a doctor or lifetime asthma. Or if you put those two together, a 32% increased risk of both current and lifetime asthma. Nitrogen dioxide also interferes with lung and brain development in children. Next slide, please. In the general population, nitrogen dioxide exposure increases the risk of all-cause mortality, especially in persons with pre-existing conditions. It increases the risk of lung and breast cancer It increases the risk of adverse pregnancy outcomes, including low birth weight. Next, please. Turning to the health effects of exposure to carbon monoxide. The elderly, the fetus, children, and persons with cardiovascular and pulmonary diseases are particularly sensitive to carbon monoxide. Tissues with the highest oxygen needs, myocardium, brain, and exercising muscle, are the first to be affected. Exposure during pregnancy increases the risk of low birth weight. Carbon monoxide exposure can exacerbate asthma. Chronic exposure increases risk of dementia and congestive heart failure. People with coronary artery disease are vulnerable to low levels of carbon monoxide, and there's no safe level of exposure to carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide causes death by asphyxiation because carbon monoxide attaches to hemoglobin, displacing oxygen. Next slide, please. Exposure to particulate matter increases blood pressure, risk of stroke, risk of premature mortality, bronchitis, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, asthma onset and exacerbation, low birth weight, and preterm birth. Gas stoves and ovens produce twice as much particulate matter as electric cooking. Formaldehyde is a known carcinogen and lung, skin, and eye irritant, and there's no safe level of exposure to formaldehyde. 2 comprehensive reviews, one conducted jointly by Physicians for Social Responsibility, the Rocky Mountain Institute, Mothers Out Front, and the Sierra Club, and the other by researchers at the UCLA School of Public Health, Fielding School of Public Health, analyzed peer-reviewed studies concluding that pollutants emitted by gas burning stoves and ovens in residential homes are in fact harmful to health, especially the health of children, the elderly, and those with underlying health conditions and vulnerable minority and low income communities. Meta-analyses examine several independent studies to determine if there are consistent findings in different settings. These studies confirm the negative health effects of residential gas appliances regarding respiratory illness in children. In 1992, Hasselblad and associates analyzed 11 studies and found that children exposed to a long-term increase of 15 parts per billion nitrogen dioxide indoors have a 20% increased risk of respiratory illness. In 2013, Lynn and associates were working to see if they could verify the findings of Hasselblad and analyzed 41 studies and found quantitative evidence that gas cooking increases the risk of asthma in children, and per 15 parts per billion increase in indoor nitrogen dioxide levels increase the risk of current wheeze in children by 15%. Next, please. Further studies confirmed the negative health effects of residential gas appliances regarding asthma in children. In 2013, Belanger and associates found that asthmatic children exposed to nitrogen dioxide indoors are at dose-dependent increased risk for increased asthma morbidity, including asthma severity score, wheeze, night symptoms, and rescue medication use. In short, these studies clearly link the ordinary use of gas stoves with harm to human health, especially children. The scientific evidence indicates that urgent action is needed to reduce exposures to the products of combustion of methane gas in indoor air in order to prevent what we cannot cure.
All right, thank you very much, Theodora. Super appreciate it. This is very helpful and sets the stage nicely for our next presenter, Ann Turner, who's going to talk a little bit about some of the environmental justice issues related to gas appliances. So I'm gonna spotlight Ann, and I'll get your slideshow up and running. But Ann, if you'd like to introduce yourself, go ahead.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Ann Turner. I'm a retired physician. I worked in community health at Virginia Garcia Memorial Health Center. And now I've been volunteering with Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility for about the last 5 years. And so tonight I'm going to talk about environmental justice concerns related to gas appliances and gas in general. So next slide. So in environmental justice, first of all, to just define it, the EPA defines it as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. However, according to Professor Robert Bullard from the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, quote, whether by conscious design or institutional neglect, communities of color in urban ghettos, in rural poverty pockets, or on economically impoverished Native American reservations face some of the worst environmental devastation in the nation. Next slide. So we, as Melanie discussed, we really can't talk about environmental justice without talking about fracking, which is talking about the full life cycle of gas. But I will also talk about environmental issues that have to do with gas power plants that generate electricity, and then also gas in our homes. Next slide. So, although there's no fracking in Oregon per se, still 3/4 of the gas that we use is fracked. And these fracking wells are located in low wealth and minority neighborhoods, near residences, schools, playgrounds, or on or near tribal lands, and they contaminate the air around them, including as well as the groundwater and soil, with these horribly toxic chemicals, which are associated with increased rates of cancer, birth defects, and asthma. Fracking also causes earthquakes locally, and it depletes the local water supply because of the enormous amounts of water that are required for the fracking operation. Next slide. So this is just an example. This is actually an oil fracking pump, but it's right next to a playground in Colorado, which is one of the places that Oregon gets its gas. Next slide. So these fracking operations often use temporary labor camps, so-called man camps, that really place a burden on the local infrastructure, including public safety, community resources, and public health. But they're also associated with increased rates of crime, motor vehicle accidents, and sexually transmitted infections in the community. And really importantly, they result in increased violence, including sexual assault and death among Native American women. Next slide. So to say a little bit about Oregon's 6 gas power plants. So I got the statistic of 1/3 of Oregon's electrical grid, as opposed to 25%, but it's somewhere in that ballpark. And these 6 gas power plants are Oregon's top polluters, and they're located in counties that are rural and all have significant minorities in health, well, all but one have significant minorities in health disparities. 2 are in Morrow County, 2 in Umatilla, and 1 in Klamath, and the 6th is in Columbia County. And as Melanie mentioned, and we'll talk a little bit more later, DEQ, the Department of Environmental Quality in Oregon, is prepared to exempt all of these power plants from its climate protection program. Next slide. So this is some information that really calls out the health disparities of people in these, in 3 of these 4 counties. So first of all the counties are rural, but they also have a higher minority population of Latinx and Native Americans. And looking at the Robert Wood Johnson County Health Rankings, 3 of the 4 counties have poor health outcomes related to the quality and length of life. And additionally, the same 3 of the 4 counties have rankings in the lowest quartile for health factors that include things like access to medical care, social and economic factors, and the physical environment. So there are 36 counties in Oregon, but 1 or 2 of the counties sometimes were not ranked. So that's why you see, so the higher numbers mean the worse health outcomes. Next slide. So gas in our homes is related to air pollution and environmental justice. So as Theodora mentioned and Melanie mentioned, the gas appliances that are vented outdoors pollute our outdoor air, and air pollution worldwide is primarily due to fossil fuel emissions, which accounted for 1 out of every 5 deaths, almost 1 out of every 5 deaths in 2018, and is also associated with increased COVID-19 death rates. And it disproportionately, not unsurprisingly, impacts environmental justice communities. So in 2018, the Oregon Report on Climate Change and Public Health indicated that BIPOC, low-income and low-wealth communities are disproportionately impacted by exposure to air pollution, and this has resulted in their increased risk of heart disease, stroke, respiratory disease, and cancer, which are 4 of the 5 top causes of death in Oregon. Next slide. So again, asthma and air pollution and environmental justice go hand in hand. And I'd like to just paraphrase a quote from the World Health Organization, which says that the strongest risk factors for developing asthma include environmental exposure to inhaled substances and particles, such as air pollutants and chemical irritants. And that research has shown significant racial, ethnic, and income disparities in asthma rates, with poor asthma outcomes compared to the general population. And for this reason, asthma is a particularly important health indicator, health equity indicator. And next slide. So this is borne out in Multnomah County, where the average rate of asthma is 10%. It's 11% in all of Oregon. But among those who earn less than $20,000 per year, or who are on the Oregon Health Plan, the rate of asthma is greater than 14%, in some areas as high as 25%. And there are higher percentages of ethnic minorities who live in census tracts with higher levels of air pollution and higher rates of asthma. So in other words, the census tracts with higher levels of air pollution and higher rates of asthma have a higher percentage of ethnic minorities. And next slide. So gas stoves and ovens also have a lot to do with environmental justice. And so besides causing asthma, next slide, those who live in environmental justice communities are more likely to be renters. And as renters, they really have no control over their appliances. Often their appliances are poorly maintained, and they're often poorly vented. And often folks have fewer windows to open to vent these appliances. they live in smaller spaces, which means that the concentration of these pollutants is higher. And they often live in crowded living conditions so that they're likely to be using their appliances more. And in addition, finally, they're living in neighborhoods where the outdoor air is polluted as well. So this increases their risk of asthma even more, or other effects of these air pollutants. So environmental justice is an important issue, and I'm going to turn it back to Damon to introduce Samantha.
Great, thank you so much, Anne, much appreciated. I see a question just came up about whether or not this webinar is being recorded. It is, and we'll be posting it to the Oregon PSR YouTube account shortly after we wrap up this evening. So, but next up, I'm very excited to introduce our staff climate justice organizer, Samantha Hernandez, who's going to talk a little bit about what folks can do to limit and reduce some of the health impacts of gas appliances. And I'll let you take it away, Samantha, and introduce yourself and get going.
Hello, everyone. My name is Samantha, and I use she, her pronouns. I am the climate justice organizer at OPSR. I started in May, and it's been a really exciting summer to start this amazing job. And today I'm going to talk to you all about how to protect your health from gas stove pollution. Next slide, please. So just to briefly recap what our former presenters talked about, indoor air is largely unregulated and can sometimes be more polluted than outdoor air. Gas stoves are a large source of toxic pollutants indoors. And sometimes indoor pollution from gas stoves can reach levels that would be illegal outdoors. And, you know, as Theodora mentioned, there are various studies that support the fact that there are well-documented risks to respiratory health from gas stove pollution. Next slide, please. And so I am going to go over some harm reduction strategies and budget-friendly ways to protect your health from gas stove pollution. We realize that not everyone can afford to replace their entire stove. And so I'll just, briefly going over some ways that if you don't have the financial means to do that, you can do other things to protect your health. Next slide, please. And so the one easy way to protect your health from gas stove pollution is ventilation. So opening a window while you're cooking so that air can ventilate outside, and then using your exhaust hood, or some people call it your range hood. And basically what this does is it captures the fumes and vents them outside. When you're cooking with gas, you're burning fuel in a much more confined space. And so pollutants can't escape easily or dilute. And so this is why it's really important to open your windows while you're cooking and use your exhaust hood. And then something else to note is when you are cooking, try to use the back burners, because the back burners sit right underneath the ventilation system. And so it's more likely to capture more fumes and ventilate them outside. Next slide, please. Thank you. And then another way that you can protect your health from gas stove pollution is using electric appliances. So that includes things such as microwaves, toaster ovens, rice cookers, crock pots. I've used a crock pot before, and you can make some really delicious soups in there. Portable single induction burners, electric tea kettles, a heat plate, and of course, electric stoves are also awesome. So if you have an electric stove, you know, not all cooking is harmful, and electric stoves are perfectly fine to use. Yes, next slide, please. And I am briefly going to go over induction stoves and how induction stoves work. And so right here you see a little animation of a single portable induction cooktop. And basically, you know, underneath the glass, there is an electromagnetic coil of cables that are usually made of copper. And when the stove is turned on, when you turn on the portable induction cooktop, there is an electric current that runs through the coils, and it creates this magnetic field that induces this electric current on the metal part of the pot or pan and causes the molecules in the pot or pan to agitate. And so that's actually what creates the heat that allows you to cook on an induction stove. It's basically like, it's based on like magnets, which I thought was pretty interesting, and is why it's more efficient, because it's heating up what it's coming into contact with. And you can, you know, find portable induction cooktops on Amazon for, I've seen some for like ranging from 55 to 60 to 70, if that's something that you are interested in perhaps exploring to buy. Just wanted to put that out there. Next slide, please. And then I just briefly also wanted to mention that if you are thinking about maybe buying an induction stovetop, that you need to buy cookware that's induction compatible. And so, you know, this is an infographic that was made by Alex Dos Diaz from the Spruce. And, you know, you can use cast iron pans, enameled cast iron pans, stainless steel, but not all. To make sure that the pots and pans have a magnetic layer, so that you can cook with the induction stovetop. Yeah, next slide. And then again, just briefly what I mentioned, aluminum, all copper, or glass cookware will not cook on an induction cooktop unless they have like that magnetic bottom layer. And again, you know, these are just like alternative ways of cooking that, you know, that we can possibly use if it's of interest to anyone. Yeah, next slide. And then I briefly wanted to just briefly discuss, you know, protecting your health during climate disasters. You know, more and more, unfortunately, we are enduring these climate catastrophes, and we are being burdened with having to really make our home climate resilient, even though you know, the burden shouldn't solely be placed on the individual. You know, power grids should be updated and made more resilient. Infrastructure should be, you know, maintained and should be built to be climate resilient. And of course, you know, the government should be better prepared for the increasing chaos of climate change and climate catastrophes. Yeah, I briefly, went over some short-term solutions, immediate ways, immediate things that you can do to protect your health. But, of course, we also need some long-term solutions, when we are, enduring wildfires, we are forced to stay at home. And, one thing that medical professionals advise is that you don't do anything to stir up more particulate matter in the home. So that includes things like, not vacuuming or lighting candles or using your gas stove. And so these are, things that we're thinking about as we're trying to make this transition to electrification. There's just so many intersecting ways that these issues come at play. Yes, next slide, please. And then I want to finish my presentation with a call to action, which I think is really cool. And focusing again more on the long-term solutions that we can take to protect our health. The Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, commonly known as DEQ, is developing a new greenhouse gas reduction program that they call the Climate Protection Program, and that's being abbreviated as CPP. And there are going to be hearings on September 22nd and September 30th. And, DEQ is inviting the public to submit comments on this plan, this climate protection program. And this is really important because, this climate protection program, unfortunately, does not do enough. It provides exemptions from fracked gas power plants. Like Anne mentioned, the top 6 fracked gas power plants in Oregon would be exempted. It allows for loopholes for Oregon's biggest polluters, and it prioritizes polluters' profits of communities over our health. And so if anyone is interested, I would highly encourage you all to attend a webinar that's going to be held on Tuesday, September 21st at 6 p.m. And basically this webinar, it's not a webinar, it's more of a conversational panel. Will focus on the environmental justice issues that are at stake for Oregon with this new climate protection program. And we'll provide more context and help you come up with ideas for your comment to DEQ if you're interested in writing a comment. Yeah, and I think Damon put the link in the chat if you'd like to register for the webinar. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you all for being here and listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Samantha. We can't do like a round of applause from the audience, so I'll fill in as our tech host. And actually, let's get everybody back on camera so that we can do a few questions and answers. Evelyn asks about those hearings for the climate protection program that DEQ is hosting. Yes, those are public hearings that are happening, Evelyn. So if you go to the bit.ly/EJ-CPP there, and I'll put that in the chat one more time again. If you paste that into your browser, that'll bring you to all of the details on that webinar that prepares you for those 2 public comment sessions. We've got a couple of different questions, and I do want to try to keep us on time, so I'm going to try to get us to go through them fairly quickly. And I'm going to start with a question from a little while ago from Patsy Kohlberg, who asks, why does biogas produce only half of the carbon of fossil gas? Is that due to differences in extraction, transport, refinement, etc.? I'm wondering, Melanie, if you might be able to help us out.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Patsy. I probably should have said CO2 equivalents when I was talking about that. A lot of people say that when something comes from a biological source, because it has embodied carbon that came from CO2 in the atmosphere, if you do the calculations, it kind of comes out to be something that's negative. But in fact, because of the energy that has to go into creating the biogas, to purify it, to transport it, the methane leakage, it really doesn't pencil out to be something that's negative. So that may not be a detailed enough explanation, but that's my understanding.
Excellent, thank you, Melanie. The next question from Heather asks, I think this might be a good one for Theodora. What do you mean by the term exposure for all of these components of gas? How do people know if they're being exposed in their homes?
Hi, that's a very good question. And all of a sudden it's like, well, we assumed all of this, but when you're burning fossil fuels, these things are emitted as products of the combustion of the fossil fuel. So if you're inside your house and you're burning gas, you're going to be producing these pollutants. And we've known about carbon monoxide for many, many years because people have died from overexposure to carbon monoxide, in their cars, in their homes, because carbon monoxide is produced by some appliance. With gas stoves and ovens, ovens particularly are really, people were heating their homes by leaving their oven door open with a gas oven. And during that, carbon monoxide is produced at high levels, or can be produced at high levels, enough to set off an alarm and kill people if they don't have an alarm. So we've known about that for a long time, but as far as these studies are concerned, the amounts of these pollutants have been measured, and that's why we know that they are produced in enclosed spaces and they've been measured outside. We have regulations to control the pollutants outside, but we don't have any regulations in the US. They're present in Canada, and the World Health Organization has recommended levels to control exposures in outdoor air, but in indoor air, but not the US. So I don't know if that answers your question, but you can also measure the levels of these things in your home with an indoor air monitor. If you happen to have one of those, my brother gave me one for my birthday, and I've just been playing with it for days. And yes, those things are produced when I turn on my gas stove. So yes. Okay, that's my answer.
Thank you, Theodora. We've got only a couple more minutes, so we're going to try to work towards wrapping up here pretty quickly. But you can find staff email addresses on our website if you'd like to keep the conversation going and ask any additional questions. We have a question about, can somebody go into a little more detail about the exemptions that gas companies are getting from the draft Oregon Department of Environmental Quality rules on the Climate Protection Program? I'm going to take an initial crack at this, and then I'll open it up to anybody else who wants to chime in. But one of the major issues here is that the electrical sector is left out entirely. And so if you were to be in a circumstance, for example, Oregon is transitioning to 100% clean electricity for utilities, but if a server farm wanted to buy up a gas power plant and use it for the process of Bitcoin mining, which is the process of creating more internet space for keeping track of the logs of Bitcoin transactions, which is a very energy intensive process, then that gas power plant would not be covered by Oregon's greenhouse gas reduction rules, which just doesn't make any sense. Additionally, if the notorious Jordan Cove LNG export terminal and Pacific Connector fracked gas pipeline were ever to be built in Southern Oregon, under the draft rules, that would also not be covered by the greenhouse gas reduction program. So those are just a couple of examples of the way the policy is written now, that where very large emitters of greenhouse gases are not held to the reduction standards that they should be. So those are some reasons to attend the public comment sessions for Oregon DEQ. Does anybody want to add anything to that answer that I gave on the exemptions?
The only thing I would say is that I think the rationale was not to double count or double regulate the gas plants which provide our electricity, since under House Bill 2021, that is already regulated. So, but there's this huge loophole, because if a gas plant is not being used to provide electricity, then it would be exempt.
Yes, and the only addendum I would add is that HB 2021 doesn't cover exported power either. That's the other issue.
Right.
And I just want to, I don't know if you said anything about the environmental justice issues, but it apparently does not really, DEQ is not worrying about the communities where there can be a trade off of the responsibility of these companies who are doing the polluting, and so that that sort of cap and trade thing, and so the people in communities around these plants are not being helped by this.
Right, so, just sort of moves the pollution calculations around, but still ends up in people's lungs. Yeah.
Despite that being something that the DEQ says they're really focused on, but they're not paying any attention to their own guidelines.
That's right. They've named environmental justice and improving public health as priorities. Yeah. So I think we're a little past time, so I'm going to start to wrap up a little bit here, and I'll leave us with some of the rhetorical questions that Evelyn has put in the chat of, can we figure out a way to get Energy Trust to give incentives not for natural gas, but for electrification? I think those are good ideas. Since landlords are required to provide carbon monoxide monitors to protect renters, could there be a way to legislate more robust mechanisms to protect renters from poor indoor air quality due to gas appliances? That's a good idea. I think all of these things are stuff that we should take note of and keep talking about as we look towards future Oregon legislative sessions. I want to thank everybody once again for being a part of this as well. Thank you to our panelists, Melanie, Theodora, and Samantha. Really appreciate all of the hot topics that you've covered here. And I would encourage those who are watching to please go to our website, oregonpsr.org, and sign up for our action alerts if you haven't already, and become a member. And you can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We are various variations on Oregon PSR at all of those social media sites, and you can follow us there. And follow us on YouTube, which is where we will post a recording to this webinar shortly after we're finished. Any last comments or words from any of our panelists before we wrap up?
Just want to say thanks to everybody for coming and being interested.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank
you so much. Good night, everybody.